In this lesson, we are going to talk about some of the key features and key forms of quadratic equations. So let's start by looking at some key features that we've already dealt with, but just want to remind you of what they are and what we're going to be looking for. So remember that a maximum or a minimum is your vertex. And depending on where that vertex is in your parabola will help you determine if it's a maximum or a minimum. For example, in this first graph here, our vertex, this point right here. When you look at it, is this your highest point or your lowest point on the graph? This is your highest point on the graph. There's nothing above it. That makes this a maximum. And again, it's your vertex. So your vertex is -4 and +6. So again, if you're asked to compare a maximum or a minimum, remember, you're looking for your vertex and then determine if that vertex is a maximum or a minimum. If we're looking at the second picture, again, here's your vertex. And is that going to be a maximum or a minimum? Well, it's our lowest point on the graph, so it's a minimum. And our vertex, of course, is 0, 0 for this example. Now, they don't always give you a graph. Sometimes you're just given a function and asked to compare a maximum or minimum. Now, usually we can tell what our vertex is, especially when they give it to you like in this example where it's already in vertex form. But just think about whether or not this graph opens up or down to be a maximum or minimum. This has already told you this is a minimum, so we just have to determine the vertex. This vertex is going to be -3, -4, and g of x's vertex is going to be +5, +2. So now that we found the vertex, we can compare the minimums. So think about when you're talking about a maximum or minimum value, and we did this a few lessons ago, what value is actually the minimum? Is it your x value or your y value? We're usually talking about the height of the function, which would be your y value. So we are comparing a minimum of -4 and a minimum of +2. So which function, f of x or g of x, has the greater minimum? Since 2 is greater than -4, g of x has the greater minimum. Now let's talk about some different forms and what key features we can obtain from those forms. So if you're looking at example 3 with me, this is standard form. In standard form, you can find any information you want, but there's usually a little bit of work involved. For example, to find the vertex, you'd have to use the vertex formula, or to find the zeros, you could factor, you could use the quadratic formula, or you could complete the square. But there is one key feature you can see just by looking at it. Take a look at your C value. The C value is actually your Y-intercept. And we know this because when you're trying to find a y-intercept, you can plug in 0 for your x value. And what would happen is 0 squared is 0, 3 times 0 is 0, and you'd be left with just -7. So your point would be 0, -7, which is a y-intercept. So remember, when you're looking at standard form, which is your ax squared plus bx plus c, your c value is your y-intercept. If we look at example 4, this is vertex form. And I think you can gather from the name what key feature we can obtain. We can find the vertex. Your vertex will always be your h and k value, right? That would be your h and k value. But you have to remember that the sign for h is different in your vertex than it is in vertex form. For example, this vertex here would be a +9, +3. If we look at example 5, we haven't dealt with this form in a little while, but if you think back to when we were factoring, this has already been factored for you. We call this factored form. And if you think back to when we were factoring to solve quadratics, what key features could we get from these two sets of parentheses? We can find the zeros, or the roots, or solutions, or x-intercepts. All of those mean the same thing, right? This is where we would take each parenthesis and make it equal to 0, and then we solve. And so you end up with two answers. Here I got 4 and -7, so those are my two zeros, 4 and -7. The last one is kind of weird. This kind of looks like it could be standard form, but it could also be vertex form. So there's a couple of things that you can find. First of all, if we think about this as standard form, you absolutely can find your y-intercept. So we've got our y-intercept here of -36, because that is our c value. But because you don't have a b value in there, we could also call this vertex form, because you can actually get your vertex from there as well. If we think about what's inside the parentheses, that would make a 0 in there, right? X plus 0. And then outside the parentheses, we have that -36. So in this example, our y-intercept is our vertex. So you can get both of these key features from this form. Hope that helps. That's the end of this short lesson. Go ahead and try some practice.